Welcome to New Rechts, or for our English listeners, New Right. My name is Daan de Liever, and today we're going to talk about the relationship between Slovakia and Ukraine. Recently, of course, there's been a lot of talk about it with the whole quote-unquote fight about Russian gas. So we're going to discuss this topic today with Stephen Auer. Thank you for being here today.
You're welcome, and thanks for your invitation.
For people that don't know you, a little bit of a background. You are a professor in European Studies at the School of Modern Languages and Culture of the University of Hong Kong. And you have written a lot of books, such as European Disunion and Liberal Nationalism in Central Europe. And you have written articles at different journals, such as the Financial Times and Politico. It's nice, but before we start into what's happening now, maybe we can start a little bit as a background. What has historically been the relationship between Slovakia, where you are originally from, that's good maybe also to mention, and Ukraine?
Well, in fact, I'm from Czechoslovakia, right? And it was communist Czechoslovakia when I grew up then. And so back then, the relationship between communist Czechoslovakia and the Soviet Union, rather than either Russia or Ukraine, right, was complicated in that people who were unhappy with the communist regime would have been suspicious of the Soviet Union because we had to live under the Soviet tutelage, and I was one of those, right? But those who were sympathetic towards communism might have been also more sympathetic towards the Soviet Union. And so that, I think, is reflected in the current divisions in Slovakia. And in many ways, I think that the divisions within Slovakia are also reflected across Europe. So just like Europe as a whole, Slovakia is internally divided. So if the collective West is in a new Cold War with Russia, as it seems, right, because of its aggression against Ukraine, you have to take sides. And those who are more shaped, like myself, by anti-communism and commitment to Western-style democracy, so I am on the side of Ukraine, as many people in Slovakia are. But those who are sympathetic towards communism, and some people perhaps also on the extreme right, appear to be sympathetic towards Russia. So I do find Slovak politics interesting in that sense that we do have growing divisions also across Europe, in Western Europe, in Austria, in Germany, I assume perhaps in Netherlands too, that there are people who seem to be sympathetic towards Putin's Russia and those who oppose Putin's Russia, and that shapes always their perspective on Ukraine.
That's a good point. I do see in Europe in general, not just extreme right or communists that are skeptical. I think people in general are just afraid of the threat that the European Union puts on like the national sovereignty of countries, and people have this deluded idea, I think, that Russia has an alternative. And of course, it does not have a suitable alternative, but I think there is some serious concerns about our own politics, and this is, I guess, projected maybe on Russia as the savior, which is, of course, a false complex. But I can see where you're coming from. But I'm also curious then, if I guess you had this complicated relationship in the communist era, how did it develop then into let's say the modern era of 2025?
Yeah, well, I do want to expand a bit on what you just said, because that is hugely important, right? That the EU is in a very strange position in relation to Ukraine and in relation to Russia. You could even say that the EU's official position is somewhat incoherent in that, the president of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, time and again praises Ukrainians for their fight for Europe, as she says it, right? And I believe that, yes, Ukrainians fight for Europe, but primarily they fight for Ukraine, and they fight for Ukraine in Europe, so they see that fight also in relation to Ukraine's relationship to Europe. But the key point is that those Ukrainians who are truly European, you could almost say, are not fighting. They are in Prague, they are in Amsterdam, perhaps, or they are in Berlin. Because Europe that was constructed after the collapse of communism in 1989, that Europe without borders, was meant to be post-national, right?
Yes.
And in some ways even post-political, but post-national. But post-nationalists are not very good at fighting wars. You need a commitment to a nation, which is what Ukrainians have. And this is where it is quite funny to watch that the EU almost has now adopted a substitute nationalism, because the only nationalism that is respectable in Brussels is Ukrainian nationalism in many ways, because Ukrainians are seen as fighting for Europe, right? While if you are strongly committed to defending Slovak or Austrian or German or Dutch national interest, then you are probably suspect in Brussels. But I believe actually that it is exactly in response to a more assertive imperialist Russia that we need viable nation states. And Poland, I think, presents a good example of that attitude, because Poland is taking the threat of Russia seriously and it's building up its military capabilities, right? But I also agree emphatically with what you said, that Russia does not provide a viable alternative for those people across Western Europe, Central Europe, who might be suspicious of the supranational ambition of the European Union and want to reclaim the nation state. The challenge is to reclaim the nation state within the European Union. Mind you, not the way that Robert Fico attempts to do it, and I'm happy to expand on that, since we want to focus on Slovakia and the EU and Ukraine and Russia.
Vergeet de NOS en de NPO. Het is tijd voor Nieuw Rechts, de nieuwswebsite voor rechtsdenken Nederland.
Yes, yes, please, you can bring it into more of the modern era. One last thing I wanted to add, because we're now talking about this, which is also to me very funny in some sense, is before the whole war in 2022, Ukraine on all the list was seen as one of the most corrupt countries in the world. And there are a lot of problems, you could say, in what we, especially from a Western European, more liberal democratic stance, on what Ukraine was and is. But this seems to be forgotten in this whole situation. They're seen as, they're almost like Germany or France or the Netherlands. So in general, I think there's a lack of knowledge of Central and Eastern Europe in the Western part of Europe, and a lot of arrogance maybe. So I think that's why it's also good for our own listeners and readers to understand this situation a little bit more, also, like we said, from the historical perspective, but also in a modern sense.
Well, I mean, corruption, it is a challenging topic to discuss, because of course it is an important part of the Russian propaganda against Ukraine to say that is largely a failed state and it's corrupt, etc. And I do not want to downplay the problems with corruption. I mean, it is a major challenge. And now actually even mainstream media started reporting about that. But Ukraine is at war, right? So then, of course... And in the times of war, you need to take sides. And the commitment that the Ukrainian people have made to liberal democracy deserves our support, despite the problems that they have with corruption. You see, that is one thing where Putin massively miscalculated, I think, at the beginning of the war, because I think he truly believed that Ukraine is a failed state and that people are not attached to that country. So he really thought that the war would be over in 3 days because Ukrainians would just give up. And in actually assuming that is Putin assuming that Ukraine is not a nation, ended up producing the kind of even stronger commitment to the nationhood that Ukrainians now have shown for almost 3 years than anyone might have expected. But you are right. I mean, corruption is a very, very real problem. And in that way, sadly, I don't know whether Ukraine is all that different from Russia. The extent of corruption is very real. What is also ironic or paradoxical in relation to this kind of post-national federal Europe that some politicians in Brussels want to construct is that you oftentimes have had you had attacks in the past on Poland when it was led by the conservative government, right? That Poland doesn't live up to the Western standards of liberal democracy. And I always thought that was a bit disingenuous, because if you are serious about your support for Ukraine, then you have to recognize that a country like Poland is far more advanced in terms of really delivering good governance to its people than Ukraine is. I mean, Ukraine won't be as advanced as Western in some ways as Poland is in 10 or 20 years. That's just the reality. But it's difficult to discuss that reality in times of war. So I feel uneasy also talking about.
I understand. Let's maybe then go back to like the relationship between Slovakia and Ukraine. We talked about a little bit about the communist era. How did it advance after this era ended?
Yeah. So then, like, let's look at the situation the way it has developed over the last couple of years, right? So under the previous more pro-EU and more liberal government, Slovakia was amongst one of the staunchest supporters of Ukraine, right? And then you read the analysis in Western press that, of course, all the countries of Central and Eastern Europe have made their experience with Russia and therefore are suspicious of Russia and support Ukraine. So that all seemed all too logical. But now we have a new prime minister in Slovakia, Prime Minister Robert Fico, who was a prime minister before, who describes himself as a social democrat, but he's a former communist. And he views the lessons of Slovak and Czechoslovak history differently. And he claims that liberty came to Slovaks, to Czechoslovakia from the East, because Czechoslovakia was liberated. That's what I learned in communist Czechoslovakia, liberated from Nazism, from Nazi occupation by the Soviet Union. And that is partly true, because it is the outcome of the Second World War, right? That the Soviet Union defeated Nazi Germany. But what that story doesn't fully account for is that the Soviet Union then became the new, de facto ruler of Czechoslovakia. So liberty was not reclaimed by Czechs and Slovaks after the Second World War. They became a part of the Soviet Empire, right? And that is what people still rightly resent. But so that is also historically the source of that division to this day, that Fico skillfully employs basically nationalist stories, national sentiments, but in a way that brings Slovakia closer to Russian or to the Soviet Empire, or to the Russian Empire. And in that sense, actually, an interesting comparison could be made with Viktor Orban in Hungary, right? Because Viktor Orban in Hungary is criticized for his pro-Russian stance or being lukewarm towards Ukraine. But I have some respect for Viktor Orban's position. I think it's coherent. I think it's pragmatic. I don't agree with it, but I think it is defensible, because Viktor Orban, that is, presents himself as a peacemaker, right? And he even has the credibility that he can represent the West to some extent because of his close relationship to Donald Trump, right? So Viktor Orban wants to see himself as someone who can talk both to Trump and to Putin. And so he famously and controversially made this trip in the second half of last year, when he went to Kiev first, importantly, to meet Zelensky, then to Moscow, to meet Putin, then to Beijing, and then to Mar-a-Lago, and spoke to Donald Trump before he was even elected. So I thought that was a bold move, unconventional move, but a smart move. But what Fico did more recently is he just visited Putin in Moscow, right? So basically, in times of war, taking side with a country that clearly is the aggressor in this war, and it's not a partner to deal with. And he went there because Ukraine decided that it will not renew the contract of delivering gas to Slovakia and the rest of Europe, which is a move that was not surprising. If anything, it's surprising how long those gas deliveries continued. And again, it's kind of, I find it revealing that Fico is quite isolated in that critical stance towards Ukraine, because he now sees Zelensky more of his enemy than President Putin. So even when you look at Austria, that is also traditionally quite sympathetic towards Russia, or you look at Hungary, there is not that much support that Fico is getting from other capitals in Europe. So I think that Fico's move is a bit it's foolish. He's quite isolated, and I'm not quite sure what he hopes to achieve.
Does he get a lot of support, you feel like, from the Slovak people themselves or not in this move?
That is part, I suppose, of the question that I kind of raised towards the end. There is a significant proportion of Slovak electorate to whom his posture will appeal, because people are worried about Slovakia being dragged into the war, right?
Mhm.
So I think that calculus might work out well for him. So interestingly, so there was a very public dispute between Zelensky and Fico on Twitter, or what is now called X, and Fico wanted to meet Zelensky. Zelensky said, well, okay, then come to Kiev. Fico didn't go to Kiev. He wanted to meet him in Slovakia, but instead the leader of the Slovak opposition, Šimečka, who used to be the deputy president of the European Parliament, Michal Šimečka, went to Kiev, which seemed like a bold move, right, and a strong statement of support for Ukraine by the Slovak opposition. But then Fico cleverly used it to his advantage, claiming that Šimečka might have committed Slovakia to position Slovak soldiers there if there is a peace agreement or whatever future arrangement. So that is the contest, I suppose, over the Slovak electorate. And that's hard to judge whether that will work out for Fico. I think a lot will depend on actually what happens next in Ukraine, and that is more likely to be decided between Donald Trump and the Russian President Putin, and hopefully also the Ukrainian leadership. I don't know whether Europeans will have much say in any of this.
I also don't think they will have much say in this if I'm looking at it. But I'm curious what you think of this argument of the tension that you see, that you already mentioned Viktor Orban. He also makes it just like we just discussed with Slovakia, that he's pragmatic. He wants cheap energy. That's good for the economy. We're seeing with Germany, for example, what happens when you don't have cheap energy. Germany is deindustrializing. They have a very hard time with their economy. I guess a lot of Europe has. They're saying, I am primarily looking for my own people. It can be Slovak people, it can be the Hungarian people, because they're, I guess, taking, in some sense, a similar stance on this, especially this conflict about gas. Mm-hmm. Do you think there's any merit to the fact that he's saying, I want cheap energy for my people? Maybe I agree or disagree with Putin, but I need to make a deal now that Zelensky is saying we're not going to help with this anymore.
Yeah, I think that's an extremely myopic and foolish argument, in that security matters, right? Mm-hmm. And if Putin prevails in this war, and I honestly hope that the U.S. administration under Trump will surprise many of the critics, because there are certainly strong elements within his administration and some of the gestures that Trump presented, that they want peace through strength. Even when you look at the recent events in Israel, peace through strength. So I certainly hope that Trump won't be a pushover for Putin, and we might be pleasantly surprised about a much more robust and confrontational stance by the U.S. towards Putin's Russia. But to say yes, I am just concerned with Slovak interests. Well, but it's not enough to be just concerned with Slovak economic interests or immediate Slovak economic interests. Security is even more important, and a Putin who would have prevailed in Ukraine would be emboldened and pose a very serious security threat to Slovakia and to Hungary, in fact. And to be honest, like Fico posturing about this suspension of gas supply, it's also quite divorced from reality, because Europe-wide there has been a reorientation. The dependency on Russian gas has been greatly reduced over the last 3 years, and actually the US, and even more so than under President Trump, is a big part of the solution, because the US has plentiful supplies of gas, and it is being imported to to Europe. So there is no immediate shortage of gas. And in fact, the Europeans have their own resources that they are not willing to exploit. Right, there is a new technology to extract gas. I think in the Netherlands you have immense resources of gas.
Yes, we have our own problem with this.
Rethinking. Germans need to rethink them abandoning nuclear energy.
Yes.
The Dutch might need to be more open to extracting gas through these new methods as the Americans have been doing. Americans now actually produce more gas than Russia. I don't know whether many people are aware of it. So obviously, transporting it all the way to Europe, it's liquefied gas that comes to Europe. That makes it more expensive, and energy in Europe is way more expensive than in the United States. But betting on cheap supply of energy from Russia, that was the bet that the German successive governments made. First Gerhard Schröder, the social democratic leader, and then Angela Merkel. That bet didn't pay off because you make yourself totally dependent on Russia. And Russia already proved as an unreliable partner already in the summer of 2021, before the outbreak of the war. Russia suspended supplies. But honestly, just looking at the bigger picture, Austria, that is not that hawkish against Russia. They just had their supplies suspended, and there wasn't that much fuss about it. They prepared for it. So Slovakia also prepared for it under the previous government. So and even Fico's government acknowledged that there is no immediate threat of shortage. But yes, the high prices for energy are a serious concern for all Europeans. But I don't think that Russia gives you the answer. I mean, Putin's Russia, certainly.
That's a fair point. I guess the last question that I would have is, how do you think this relationship will move forward? Of course, you said it really depends on what's happening in Ukraine, but are there anything that you can tell me or you see about movements now politically in Slovakia and in Ukraine, maybe how this relationship can maybe be restored, can it be improved, or do you think it will just get worse from now on?
Yes, I mean, you shouldn't predict anything particularly about the future, right? And so much is in flux now. But there are some scenarios that one can outline. And honestly, a lot depends obviously on whether and how and when the war might come to some kind of peaceful settlement. But I do not think that Fico is in a strong negotiating position. One thing that also makes Fico very different from Orban is that, well, Orban is a conservative politician who is actually pro-American. If the United States is led by his friend, Donald Trump. So in that way, he can clearly position himself, and Prime Minister Orban already offered Budapest as the place to negotiate any future kind of peace agreement. And now, honestly, Fico is trying to parrot what Orban has been doing for much longer. And Fico also offered Bratislava as a place for negotiations. But I do not think that Fico has that kind of credibility. I have followed his career basically for more than a decade, and he is actually quite anti-American, anti-Western. He's a former communist, basically, and he played the EU game quite skillfully. He was always a good European in Brussels, more nationalistic at home, but now that game doesn't work that much anymore. But so what's wrong with American gas if you are on that side of the divide, right? So he is anti-American, he is openly pro-Russian, and when Orban positions himself, then he talks about the interests of Europe and of Ukraine and the world, while Fico doesn't have much credibility talking about wider interests when he focuses narrowly on cheap gas from Russia to Slovakia. But yet, if the war goes ugly, if it really comes to the situation where countries like Poland or Slovakia are asked for active military help or support, then Fico could gain domestically, because, of course, understandably, the the war is not popular, and most Slovaks probably would rather stay out of it. Whether that's the wisest kind of policy, medium, long term, I don't know. So my hope is that the conflict could be resolved with the U.S. leadership. But yeah, we will see soon enough, I hope.
Let's hope that this year will indeed bring peace. It's good to have peace on the European continent. I hope indeed that Donald Trump got recently, of course, now he's officially the president of the United States. Let's hope that this will see a good time, not only, of course, for Ukraine and the neighbors, but also indeed for the entirety of Europe. I really want to thank you for having this interview. If people want to follow your work, where could they do that?
Well, I am on Twitter or X, and yeah, that's probably the best source. But and then of course I have a university website. Perhaps I would add one point though to prevent kind of misunderstandings. I do not know what Donald Trump will do. I watched the inauguration and watched the number of kind of statements on foreign policy that is made, and obviously the devil is in detail, right? Because many of his positions are basically incompatible. So one striking phrase that he used in the inauguration address that I liked was that he wants to be then remembered as a peacemaker, right, as a unifier.
Mm-hmm.
But whether and how that is compatible with his more aggressive posture, basically, towards even Canada, an old and reliable partner, or then Denmark with Greenland. I don't know whether those two positions are compatible, but for the sake of Europeans, for the sake of Ukrainians, in fact, for the sake of Russians, I hope that the strategy, a Reaganite strategy, actually, peace through strength, would work, because this is the only language that Putin understands. This is the only language that Putin's Russia understands, that only an enemy that is strong enough, that can stand up to Putin, can stop Putin. Only the language of power is the one that Putin understands. I think that is one thing that some right-wing observers across Europe and the United States underestimate.
It's a good point to finalize. I think none of us claim that we know what Donald Trump is going to do. I don't even know if Donald Trump knows what he's going to do. So we're gonna have to find out. But at least we can hope for a good outcome indeed. So thank you for this interview. I also really want to thank our listeners and readers of New Rechts. If you want to make this kind of conversations possible, please consider subscribing at nieuwrechts.nl, or you can always help us by sharing or liking or subscribing to our content on social media. Thank you, and I see you in the next time.
Thank you.